Thank you, Kim and Dylan. That was beautiful. It truly was. Wow. I attended the School for Leadership training at Eastern Mennonite Seminary the week before last, as I usually do in January. And one of the speakers was a woman named Meredith McNabb. She was a United Methodist minister. Prior to that, she was an attorney. And now she's also a church executive in Richmond. And she was telling about the long process that she went through in order to be ordained to the ministry, as I guess most of us who are ministers to some extent do. But she went to seminary for 3 years, and then she was licensed, and which requires an annual review and interview with some group of church folks. And then she, apparently in her situation, in her denomination, she was required another 3 years of sort of internship in ministry before she could even apply to be ordained. And so she went through all of this, and then she got through that 3 years, and she was in her ordination interview with this group of church officials. And the interview processed through all kinds of questions about her faith and questions about the Bible and all kinds of things, and she was just about finished. And then the final question was, tell us about your theology of failure. And boy, I wish I could think this quickly on my feet. She said, well, I told them, well, I've been pretty fortunate in life. I haven't had a lot of failure, frankly. I've been real fortunate. But, you know, you all can change that today. I wish I could think that quickly. Now, maybe we're like that. Maybe we haven't experienced much failure in our lives. Or maybe we have. More likely we have experienced failure, whatever our age, whatever our situation. Things usually don't always go perfectly. But it's an interesting question, an appropriate question. What do we believe about failure? What is our theology of failure? Actually, the theme of that School for Leadership training was broken vessels, thriving pastors. It was, part of that was the acknowledgement that we're all broken to some extent. We all fail, and we live and minister out of that brokenness, not out of our success. So, what do we do with failure? Do we see it as a bad thing? Do we see it as maybe necessary for our development? What do we learn from our failures? What do we learn from life's difficulties and hardships? And we can go beyond that and ask, what is God's role in our failures? And does God cause them? Or does God care? Does God notice? Does God help us? Well, that Psalm 139 describes a God who knows us intimately. And the first 6 verses were used there in our responsive reading. And then that psalm goes on to talk about that we cannot go where God is not. Wherever we are, God is there. That God has made us and God knows us, all parts of us. That God is nevertheless beyond us. And it concludes in verse 18, the psalmist says, I come to the end and I am still with you. That's the affirmation of the psalmist, that whatever happens in life, God is still there. We still are with God and God with us. Well, another scripture is this Jeremiah 18 that Randy read, where the prophet Jeremiah was prophesying to the nation of Israel who were being disobedient. And he writes, the word of the Lord came to him and told him, go down to the potter's house and just watch. I want to give you a message. I want to tell you something. This is God talking to Jeremiah. So he did. He went to where a potter was working on pots, you know, in the old way where they spin the wheel, and you take this clay and you shape it with your hands as it spins. You get a perfectly round shape. But the potter messed up. It wasn't turning out the way he hoped. So he just took that lump of clay and just redid it. Made another lump. Started over. And out of that began to shape something that was beautiful. And God said to Jeremiah, tell Israel, I can do the same with you. I can take your failures, your mistakes, your rebellion, all of that negative stuff, I can reshape you into useful people. People who honor me. What an image. What an image of God shaping us as a potter shapes clay. So the fact is, God can use us. He doesn't just use the best parts of us. He doesn't just use our successes, but He uses our failures. God uses broken people. And He takes that brokenness and reshapes us into vessels for service for Him. One of the speakers at the conference said that the health of the church is dependent upon our ability to admit that we don't know and can't do everything ourselves. That's what makes a church healthy. Have you thought of it that way? The health of a church is not so much our success and our goodness as it is admitting to our unhealth and our failure and even our sin. And someone also said that maybe the best response sometimes is, I don't know. You know, it's not a bad thing just to not know the direction we should be going. Because we want to have answers. We want to look competent and smart. And we try to hide our failures and our weaknesses, and that doesn't work. We know it doesn't work with God. As Psalm 139 states, God already knows us, knows everything about us. No fooling God. But we still try to put up a good front for other people. And when people ask how we're doing, our standard answer, I'm fine. I'm just fine. But sometimes we're not fine. Whether we admit it or not, we have a lot of problems, a lot of weaknesses, brokenness within our lives and our relationships, and we're not fine, whether we will acknowledge that or not. So Meredith McNabb showed a photo of a type of pottery, and Kim, you guys going to put that on the screen? Are we ready for this? I hate using technology because it seldom works, but
It should be good. I don't know which one to put on. All of them. You just
yeah, there it is. It worked. This is a type of pottery. I had never heard of this. Maybe you have. It's a Japanese form. It's called Kintsugi pottery, Kintsugi pottery. It goes back to the 15th century, where people would take broken pots or any kind of pottery that broke and mend it using gold. Actually, it's a type of lacquer or resin that's sprinkled with gold powder, gold dust. And they would mend the broken places with this gold and make a beautiful vessel out of one that appeared to be broken and useless. In fact, sometimes it says they would even break pots so that they can mend them into this kind of pattern. And you can see a number of examples there of pots this type of pottery, which is still in use in Japan today. How many of you are familiar with this? Anybody? Okay, we do have some. I'm not making this up, so there are some of you who knew more about that than I did. But to me, that really is a way of showing how God can take our brokenness and make that into something useful and beautiful once again. Now, I have also been reading a book the last few weeks, finished it a couple of weeks ago, and the title is Falling Upward, A Spirituality for Two Halves of Life, written by Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest and a prolific writer. And as I was attending this conference, I saw a lot of parallels between the book and that theme about responding to our failures. Rohr's premise in the book, and this is not unique to him, other people have observed this, but in the first part of life, shall we say the first half of life, we focus on building things. We build our identity, we develop our ego, we establish our moral codes, and we work at succeeding in life, in our work, in our relationships, and in all manner of our life. We're working toward that. But then eventually we might get to a point where we realize something's missing. There must be more. One person stated it this way: we finally, after much effort, get to the top and realize that there at the top we have leaned our ladder against the wrong building. You know, maybe we've succeeded in what we've done, but our success doesn't satisfy. We learned that not all questions have black and white answers. We learned that conventional values and status quo lifestyle is just not sufficient for us. Our efforts and our successes don't satisfy our deepest needs. And our belief system just doesn't answer all the questions. So Rohr states that, quote, sooner or later, some event, person, death, idea, or relationship will enter your life that you simply cannot deal with using your present skill set, acquired knowledge, or strong willpower. Now, did you hear that? I think for some of us that's quite profound, because we have had something in our life that has changed us permanently. Sooner or later, some event, person, death, especially the death of someone very close to us, idea, relationship, something will enter our life that we can't deal with using our present skills, knowledge, willpower. And he continues, spiritually speaking, you must be led to the edge of your private resources. That takes you right to the edge of your belief, your faith, your resources. You will stumble over a necessary stumbling stone, is what he calls this. And he's referring to Isaiah 8:14, where God is portrayed as a stumbling stone. Let God be your dread, says Isaiah. He will become a rock one stumbles over. And then Rohr states, you will and you must lose or fail at something. This is the only way that God can get us to change, is in our failure, if we fail. To let go of our egocentric preoccupations and self-sufficiency and seek a source of help and direction that is beyond us, outside of us. Most of us won't do that until we have to. You know, we won't make a change unless we have to make a change. And so this failure, this stumbling stone, is a necessary step on the road to us becoming spiritually mature. Without those failures, those stumbling stones, we're never going to grow in our faith. And he calls this stumbling a necessary suffering. He says this falling and failing and losing is a path that can lead us toward maturity, toward home. Think of the prodigal son. He didn't even think about going home until he ended up in the pig pen, literally wallowing. And then he recognized his failure, his need for change, his need for home. For Jesus and his disciples, and also ultimately for us, the crucifixion, one thing that it tells us is that was a necessary suffering. There cannot be a resurrection until there's a crucifixion. In our lives, we are more likely to turn to God's grace and to God's mercy when we have exhausted all of our own resources, our own knowledge, skill, goodness. That's when we turn to God. Paul certainly came to understand this concept. He experienced it in his own life. You remember Paul started out as Saul, a brilliant and fervent Pharisee, zealous for God, or so he thought, and he was the one out there arresting these Christian heretics who he believed did not have the right faith. But then God placed a stumbling stone in his path. And Paul describes this in Acts 26. Well, it's in Acts 9 also, but in Acts 26 he describes this encounter on the road to Damascus where Jesus, the risen Christ, came to him saying, "Paul, why are you persecuting me?" Paul had formerly been so sure of himself, driven by his adherence to God's law as he understood it. But then this sudden encounter with the living God, the resurrected Christ, the God of love rather than the God of law, brought about a complete change and conversion. He writes out of this experience numerous places. One of those is in 1 Corinthians 2, where he says, "I did not come to you proclaiming the mystery of God with lofty words or wisdom. I know nothing but Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in fear and weakness and trembling." See, he doesn't come out of his strength, but out of his weakness. A much humbler Paul recognizes the source of strength. "My speech," he says, "was not from wisdom, but with the Spirit, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God." And in the other scripture that Randy read, from 2 Corinthians 12th chapter, here Paul, up until this point, has been describing all the hardships and the sufferings that he's experienced as a disciple, a missionary for Jesus. And he lists all of his beatings and shipwrecks and persecution of various kinds. And then at the end of all that, he said, "But I can't boast. I can't boast about myself on my own behalf. I only can boast in my weaknesses." And then he continues that thought, "To keep me from being too elated," or we could say too proud, too self-assured, too competent, whatever, "a thorn was given me in the flesh," he says, "a messenger from Satan." We could call that a stumbling stone, I guess. He says, "3 times I asked the Lord to take it away, but He said," and I love this response, God said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." My power is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul concludes, "Therefore I am content, whatever happens, I am content, for when I am weak, then I am strong." Do we get that? Do we understand that it is in our weakness that God's strength provides for our needs? I guess that's Paul's theology of failure. So can we accept that belief, that theology of failure, that strength comes through weakness, that success comes through failure. It's our times of weakness and stumbling and failure that draw us to recognize our need for God. Can we view failure as a necessary step on the road to spiritual maturity?